Yes. A very warm Jai Bhim and good evening to everyone. I extend hearty welcome to all the participants to the sixth day of the Online Ambedkar Intellectual Summit 2024, organized by Mangesh Dahiwale, the founder of B.R. Ambedkar International Foundation, and Yogesh Maitreya, writer and founder of the anti-caste publication house, Panthers for Publication. This online summit is a quest to explore and uphold the core values of liberty, equality, and fraternity that Dr. Ambedkar stood for. And we need to remember him on his 133rd birth anniversary as well. The online talk is taking place on Zoom and streaming live on the Facebook page of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's Caravan. I kindly request all the participants to mute their mics. You may unmute yourself during the Q&A sessions. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I am Kshitij Moon, and I will be the moderator for today's talk. And so I completed my master's in history from Savitribai Phule Pune University, and I am currently interning with Panthers for Publication. Before we dive into our discussion, I would be honored to provide a brief 2-minute introduction of the speaker, Dr. Jesús Cháirez. So, summarizing Professor Cháirez' extensive work in 2 minutes is a huge challenge in itself because he has such a lot of research articles on different subjects. Some of his research expertise are South Asian history, caste, race, Dalit studies, global intellectual history, and Mexico. He received his Doctor of Philosophy from Cambridge University in 2015. He is a lecturer of modern history with a focus on race and ethnicity in the University of Manchester. Professor Cháirez has authored the book Rethinking Untouchability, the Political Thought of B.R. Ambedkar, which was published recently in March 2024. His book talks about how untouchability is a social issue in India, become a political concern in the early 1900s. It focuses on Ambedkar's effort and the ideas he used to highlight untouchability as a significant problem. According to Professor Cháirez, Ambedkar aimed to understand the various aspects of untouchability to end this discriminatory practice. He didn't just see it as a matter of ritual purity, but also as a complex issue tied to politics, history, race, space, and emotions. Ambedkar believed that to end untouchability, India needed big changes in its political, economic, and cultural systems. He looked at untouchability through different lenses like representation, slavery, race, village, life, global perspectives, and even the idea of creating Pakistan. So today, Professor Cháirez has joined us all the way from England to talk about untouchability as a political idea, political thought of B.R. Ambedkar. I now welcome Professor Cháirez to lead the talk. Welcome, Professor. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Kshitij, and thank you to Mangesh for such a kind invitation. I'm just gonna try to share my screen, although it says like it has been disabled, but
Yes, I will turn it on. Yes.
Right.
Yes, sir. Now you would be able to share your screen.
Okay. Thank you so much. Share. Okay. So thank you once again, Kshitij. As it was already mentioned, my name is Jesús Cháirez Garza, and I'm really happy to be here. As I know Mangesh for quite a while, so today I'm just going to give you a brief introduction about the work that I've been doing, and particularly some ideas about what my book is about. So I just want to start with a little bit about me, because I know maybe a lot of you don't know me. So I come from Mexico, from the northeast of Mexico, and I started to study Ambedkar during my master's. It was there when I became aware of Ambedkar as a thinker, and when I found out about his ideas, when I found out about his writings, it was something that I was completely surprised that we haven't heard about him before, at least in my country. Like in my country, uh, I still probably not a lot of people know about him. So I come from, therefore I come from a kind of like an outsider perspective. So I don't have like that colonial connection, if that some people have when they study India. And I'm also not an Indian myself. I also don't come from South Asia. Um, but the work that I've been doing, of course, draws on the work of other people that help to keep the writings of Ambedkar and the work of Ambedkar alive. And part of my interpretation of Ambedkar works is actually to argue that it was the community, it was like the different Dalit social workers, reformers, politicians, and so on, that allowed us to have like this new reinterpretation and resurface of Ambedkar as an all India political figure. Why? Because as we know, after Ambedkar passed away, um, the figure that at least that it was claimed by the state as the representative of untouchables or Dalits, it was or at least in official histories, it was Gandhi. And it was only until people like Kanshiram, Mayavati, and many others started kind of to reclaim Ambedkar and of course like Dalit Panthers and many other more people that are too many to uh, to 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 count. It was there when we started to see a resurface and an academic interest um, of other scholars and other people even outside of India, just like myself. So that is like where I'm coming from. So I owe a lot to Dalit intellectuals, to Dalit historians, and so I have always been grateful about this. So where does my in terms of my field, where do I come from? I focus mostly on global intellectual history. That means I'm interested in how ideas change through time and how ideas are perceived and understood by particular people. In this case, I focus on the writings of Ambedkar and particularly on his view of untouchability. So why is this kind of like important? Because usually when we think about intellectual history, most of the political concepts that people or historians or political theorists use are mostly coined in Europe or in the state or in Western society, civilization, any way you want to call it. So that means that there is kind of like an imbalance of who can produce knowledge. In this case, from my point and from my perspective, is to understand how an idea like untouchability can became sort of a political question that is actually coming from India. And in that sort of story, in that process, Ambedkar plays a key role. So the point is that we should take Dalit concepts, Dalit epistemologies, and try to understand how Dalits themselves have done it. Of course, this is my own work. It's only my interpretation of this, and of course, there are many interpretations of how someone can interpret the work of Ambedkar. So what do I argue in the book as kind of like the main argument? Basically, I start this story of Ambedkar and the question of untouchability at a time in which there is a type of political transition in India. So constitutional reforms are going to start in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But in relation to untouchability, we see that it's not entirely defined. Many regions in India claim that untouchability does not exist in the regions. I'm talking about the past. And other people claim that there is no caste discrimination. More importantly, a lot of people would argue that untouchability was only a religious issue. So, because it was a religious issue, the state, particularly the colonial state, should not intervene in whatever nature or whatever political problems may have, or whatever sort of discussion this question of caste discrimination uh, involves. So it is here where we see kind of like the problem that I'm interested in. How did that question of untouchability, from having people claiming that this was totally a regional issue, that it was not something that you could find everywhere in India, that it was seen as a religious issue where the state should not intervene, change, and how did it become to something that now we see as a question that you can find everywhere, that where we have a category of Dalits that a lot of people identify with throughout the subcontinent, and also a notion that untouchability has, or at least the people that are being discriminated by untouchability have a claim to a specific political rights, or to a specific educational quotas, or to a specific political demands. So that is where I start. Um, Following that, I argue that Ambedkar, so having that understanding that untouchability was seen as a religious issue, he attempted to bring that the problem of untouchability into the political sphere. This does not mean that untouchability before that was not political. Of course, it was, but it changed, at least in terms of legislation, in terms of how the state, the relation of the state had towards this question. So, how did Ambedkar do this? What I argue is that Ambedkar used different political ideas that were in the national arena and later on in the international arena to link untouchability and make it a bigger political question that was to be dealt with by other politicians. So specifically, I explore how Ambedkar thought about untouchability in terms of a political voice, in terms of race, in terms of liberty, independence, labor, and the question of Pakistan. So my point here is to contextualize Ambedkar, contextualize his writings. Why was Ambedkar writing something in particular in the 1920s? Why was Ambedkar writing in a slightly different way in the 1940s, and so on? So my point of view is that without context, we are in danger of making Ambedkar or imagining Ambedkar as many different ways, which do not say much about the specificity of his ideas. So, for instance, and this is not like a criticism of anyone, but for instance, nowadays, some people would argue that Ambedkar was mostly a socialist. Some would argue that Ambedkar was a liberal. Some would argue that Ambedkar was a pragmatist. Some would argue that Ambedkar was a that was influenced by Shakespeare and so on. And my point is that, well, we need to kind of like focus and see the context when Ambedkar was writing specific ideas. Those annihilation of caste is like the main sort of, is it representative of Ambedkar political trajectory throughout his career, or was that just the most radical version of Ambedkar in time? So rather than trying to kind of like find a definite way in which we can imagine or define Ambedkar, my point of view is that actually there are several versions of Ambedkar. There is an Ambedkar that was that kept changing through time. So we cannot claim that from my understanding, we cannot claim that Ambedkar was already a defined subject in the 1910s or in the early 1920s. Rather, he was learning, he was transforming his ideas. He changed perspectives in the 30s. He becomes very radical, and in the 40s he sees that things are changing, that the British are leaving India, and he has to moderate the way he thinks about the world. Okay, so in terms, so that is where I'm coming from. In terms of what the book covers, it basically has 7 main topics, and it starts with what I call a politics of ventriloquism, and I will get into that in just a few minutes. But basically, like, the idea here was who could speak for Dalits politically. As we shall see, there were many people in the 1910s and throughout the 1930s, particularly someone like Gandhi, that would claim that actually the only people that could speak for Dalits were Hindus, not even Dalits themselves, just Hindus. In that, the people from the colonial government or colonial officers would claim that actually it was their job to protect Dalits because they were still not prepared to represent themselves politically, and I will explain why they were saying this. So it is around this time of this kind of like claiming that you can speak for someone else, that the reason that I call this period of history as the politics of ventriloquism. This idea that someone could not represent himself, herself, or themselves was related a lot of time to the question of race. So, as you may know, the concept of race has changed dramatically over the last 150 years. But in the late 19th century and early 20th century, people that were deemed to be racially inferior did not have the same rights as everyone. Even this political representation was divided by gender. Most of the people that could kind of that had political representation were men, where they also had to own some land, and in specific cases, they also had to be white or European. So claiming that someone else or a particular group or community was not white or did not have land meant that they did not have any interest to protect. So that represented a problem that Ambedkar had to deal with and try to resolve in order to make claims for political power. Another question was how to make untouchability a political problem, because the question of liberty was also being discussed by many Indian intellectuals in the early 20th century. So the question here was, is independence good for everyone? Is the question of liberty equal to independence? So the problem here for Ambedkar was to make understand the colonial government, or at least try to convince them and try to convince other Indians that independence or liberty for the country did not mean that Dalits would become free. So, as we will see a little bit later on, the point that Ambedkar was trying to make was basically to show that independence in a country that was handed to, in this case, upper caste communities or dominant communities would be detrimental for Dalits or the people that he claimed to represent, right? And this question of liberty came with another set of concepts that were trying to make or to justify some differences that existed between European civilization or European, or in particular, like the way the British would see their own society and the way India would see their own society. In particular, there was the question of the village and the cities, right? So someone like Gandhi would imagine that the village was kind of what made India different from Europe, as he kind of like demonized Europe as a urban setting that was losing its core values and so on. So in this case, Ambedkar identifies this problem. He identifies this discussion, and what he tries to do is actually to claim that villages are not or were not um, a place of liberation. They were not a romantic space for everyone in India. He was trying to contextualize that the village only represented something good for someone. Of course, this does not mean that the cities are castless or that the cities are perfect. That is not my view. But Ambedkar, in some ways, was trying to argue that. Later on, Ambedkar also explored the question of communism and socialism. And what we find in that particular chapter, and I don't think that like I will discuss that in this session today because I might not have like the time. Um, but here we explore, rather than claiming that Ambedkar was a hardcore socialist or a hardcore like or that he was kind of like only interested in liberalism, what I try to show in that chapter is that actually Ambedkar sort of transformed the way he taught and transformed the ideas he used when he's asking for rights, particularly in the late 1930s when he's involved in a series of strikes and in a series of protests in favor of Dalit workers in Bombay. Finally, I talk like, and this actually, these two questions come together. Ambedkar faced a final problem, which is partition and the problem of Pakistan. And why was this a problem for him? Because partition and represented kind of like a split in the way political communities were going to function in India. Before partition, Ambedkar was kind of like imagining this way in which Dalits and Muslims could sort of come together to challenge Congress or the general constituency that he saw in that he had in mind. And later on, because he realizes that the colonial government is actually going to abandon Dalits or to some way to betray Dalits by giving power to Congress, he moves the question of untouchability to an international space. So that is basically what the book is about. So, okay. So then just to give you like some examples of what I mean by the politics of ventriloquism, for instance, we see a big change in the early 20th century, in particular because there is a different there is this notion that different communities might have different political interests. In the question, in particular, there is this confrontation between Muslims and Hindus that are demanding different political rights and different electorates from the colonial government. And it is here when we see one of the main examples in which the question of that the press classes, as Dalit used to be called, becomes and enters the political arena or a political space. So Aga Khan, when the Minto Morley reforms were about to happen, he writes to Lord Minto and says, well, if you are going to separate the electorates between Hindus and Muslims, we have a problem, because you might be counting as Hindus a community that actually might not be part of that community. And he was referring in particular to Dalits. So this becomes an issue because then we have three different groups that are going to try to claim Dalits as part of their political interests. We're going to see Muslims trying to make some conversions into Islam. We also are going to see that the colonial government is going to use the question of untouchability and Dalits to say to the Congress, you are not ready to be independent. You are not ready to have your own government. Why? Because there are a lot of people that are oppressed by you. However, the important question here and the important thing here to notice is that they are not giving political power to Dalits. Rather, they are saying we can defend them. We can speak for them. In the case of Congress, the main sort of issue that we see here is that basically Congress is going to say, no, this community and this group are Hindus, these people are Hindus, and we speak for them. So there is this denial of difference, and that is what the politics of ventriloquism is all about. So the most sort of main example that we can see of the politics of ventriloquism is that of Gandhi himself. Particularly, this is from a letter that he writes and that later becomes an article in Young India, when he's referring about what is like the position of Congress in connection to Dalits. And he says, in the instance of the starving millions, the scoffer forget in their ignorance that the millions have not even the wish to cry out or work for work or bread. Hence, we join the English historians in calling them dumb millions. We, including the scoffers, have to be their voice. We have to teach the dumb millions the first lesson. We, not they, are responsible for their awful poverty and ignorance. They don't know what they want or need. They are living corpses. So Ambedkar here is very dismissive of the people that are considered to be untouchables or the people that are considered to be Dalits, and claims we actually need to speak for them. We need to say what they want because they don't have any idea. So in Gandhi's imagination, Dalits are basically pre-political. So what is Ambedkar going to do? Ambedkar, since the Southborough Committee identified this as a problem, and he starts rejecting this notion that some other groups can speak for Dalits themselves. So what he says, for instance, in the Southborough is that the disposition of the intelligentsia is a Brahmin disposition. Its outlook is a Brahmin outlook, that he has learned to speak in the name of all. The Brahmin leader is in no sense the leader of the people. So he's basically rejecting that Dalits need someone else to speak for them. He's basically saying that it is only them that have the power to claim what their political needs are and what their political interests are too. So was this very successful during the Southborough Committee and Ambedkar's intervention? Well, not really, but some important changes did happen. What was the thing? First, we see Ambedkar as he's recognized as a leader of Dalits, which is an amazing step forward. The second thing is actually that there is the creation of a precedent that Dalits have different political interests. And that allows the question of untouchability to be seen as a political problem that requires specific political answers. So even though there was no direct representation, something that is called nomination was established. So Ambedkar here, in some ways, is successful. But that depended on the notion that everyone, all different Dalit communities at the time, see each other as one. And that was not straightforward, because in the early 20th century, there were different leaders such as MC Raja, Ambedkar, people from the north, and different movements, whether it's like Adi Dharm and so on, that did not see each other really as a community. They saw each other in terms of caste, and sometimes they saw themselves as political opponents. So it was not something automatic. So Ambedkar kind of like process of trying to make this question something that helps everyone is quite important. And I think sometimes it's not that clear. So moving to the question of race, as I already mentioned, there was this notion that not everyone that was not white, or that was not or that did not have land, could have political representation. And also there was the question that, or an understanding that racial inferiority and superiority did exist. So if you were not considered to be at par with other races, you were not, sometimes you were not entitled to have any political representation. So Ambedkar kind of like knew that he needed to challenge this question. Why? Because a lot of people would associate Dalits as people that were racially inferior. So here what I try to argue is that Ambedkar brings these ideas that he sort of learned and discussed in at Columbia University, and use them to change how untouchability, instead of seeing untouchability as a racial problem, something that H. Risley would see or would argue, he sees untouchability as a cultural issue, right? So one of like the most famous ideas, or the most famous views, that Dalits were were racially inferior, comes from this from H. Risley and the people of India. So I'm not going to read it, but like the final sort of two lines make it clear, basically, that every sort of like low caste person, or that caste is linked to race, and if you were at the top of the caste system, you were racially superior than the people that were below you. So here's where I try to explore Ambedkar's ideas as an anthropologist or as a sociologist. And there are many instances in which he discusses race. So one of them is Caste in India, an article that he produced and presented at Columbia University in 1916. Another, of course, in the 1930s, in Annihilation of Caste. And something that has not been discussed much is the report of the depressed classes and the Aboriginal Tribes Committee of the Bombay Presidency. This was actually a group of people that toured different areas of India and were trying to understand what were the problems of the depressed classes, or the question of Dalits. So just to kind of like summarize what he was thinking here, is like Ambedkar sort of dismisses the question of race by saying, what racial affinity is there between the Brahmin of the Punjab and the Brahmin of Madras? What racial affinity is there between the untouchable of Bengal and the untouchables of Madras? What racial difference is there between the Brahmin of the Punjab and the Chamar of the Punjab? And he goes on, and he says like, well, the Brahmin of the Punjab is racially of the same stock as the Chamar of the Punjab, and the Brahmin of Madras is of the same race as the Pari of Madras. Caste system does not demarcate racial division. So what he's trying to say is that race does not matter here. Actually, everyone is kind of like sort of mixed. And what he's trying to explain is that untouchability is not a racial issue. It's rather a cultural problem that Dalits were being sort of punished for having their own culture. What are the implications of this? Of course, is that Dalits have a history, that Dalits have produced their own religion, that Dalits have um, a positive sort of contribution to things, and that actually this is a problem that can be resolved. As you may know, like race at that time was considered to be fixed, something that you could not really challenge. So this is what Ambedkar was trying to do. Later on, I moved to the question of space, and of course, I explore a little bit of Ambedkar's sort of experiences in the village, but also his own kind of like rejection of it. And this, of course, Gandhi was one of the main proponents of the village, but Nehru was too. So just to show you the difference of how someone like Nehru was received in the village when he came to kind of like for the first time to rediscover India. He's kind of like showered by affection. In contrast, someone like Ambedkar, when he travels throughout the village, we see all the stress that he has, all the problems that he encounters, because he's aware that if he reveals that he is a Dalit, he can get into problems. And this is something that he describes in Waiting for a Visa, when he visits the Parsi Inn, or when he's a kid and he has to travel in the railway and so on. So there are many instances of that. Um, so rejecting the notion that the village represents India or the best of India, of course, Ambedkar sort of rejects this and sort of links it to a ghetto that perpetuates untouchability and that makes Dalits in some sort of way self-racialize and sort of identify themselves to continue that exploitation. Moving, and just to conclude very quickly, moving to the question of Pakistan, then again, we have the question that the question of Pakistan is going to change the political balance that exists in India. So this is something that I have published before and that I have sort of discussed even with for my guest here like a couple of years ago. And my idea or my argument there was that Ambedkar realizes the importance of Pakistan, and he actually tries to find different solutions for Dalits to gain political representation in before the British leave India. And this was particularly important because after the Pune Pact in 1932, basically Dalits did not get separate electors and are seen, even though they get some sort of special representation, they are seen as part of the general constituency, which meant that even though there were places for Dalits candidates to represent themselves, everyone could vote for those candidates. So basically or virtually, Congress could put any candidate they wanted. So he's trying to renegotiate that before we see partition. So after all Ambedkar's efforts to convince Jinnah of giving up Pakistan, he writes to people outside of India, to people from the independent, from the Indian Group Committee, and we'll see to W.E.B. Du Bois, and he realizes that he's getting out of options. He kind of like also resents that actually he feels that he's being betrayed by everyone, by the British. He feels that he's being betrayed by the Muslims. He feels that he's being betrayed by Congress and so on. So he launches kind of like an international effort, and this is what I call Ambedkar an internationalism. And he tries to go to the UN. He tries to he writes to Churchill, and of course he writes to W.E.B. Du Bois. The intention here is not to sort of paint Ambedkar as a conservative sort of someone that is kind of like believes in what Churchill is doing. Churchill was a very problematic man, in particular in its relation to India and Indians themselves. But rather, I'm trying to show that Ambedkar was exploring every possibility that was there for him to gain to protect the political future of Dalits. So these are some of the letters that I use, and this I also published like 5 years ago, in which Ambedkar writes to Churchill asking for help at the same time that he's writing to Du Bois, and he's saying like, well, we need you to stop independence because we are still not free, right? So after realizing that he's running out of options, after realizing that he doesn't have much room to negotiate, Ambedkar sort of goes for the last option that he has, and is basically to accept kind of like a deal with Congress. And this is kind of like me trying to say that to go against this idea or belief that Gandhi put Ambedkar there, rather Ambedkar kind of like negotiated himself into being part of the Constitution. So something that happens after partition is that the question of untouchability, to some extent, it's sort of, it disappears from the political arena for a while, because someone like Nehru and Rajendra Prasad would claim that the most important thing at this time was nationalism, that there could not be any room for any sort of communal differences, and untouchability was one of those issues. So this is where my book stops and kind of like concludes in making these questions about what happens if we reimagine these ideas and this vision and this way in which untouchability changed throughout the first 60 years in India. So I'm going to leave it there. So thank you very much. Stop sharing.
Yes. Thank you for your enlightening talk, Professor. I found it quite engaging and informative. Yes, there are definitely several versions of Ambedkar, and we can look at him from so many different perspectives. I really liked how you use the term ventriculism, and how you use the term ventriculism, and how you constructed more branches of the term. Like, we also understood how untouchability in India refers to social practices of discriminating against certain groups based on their caste, leading to their exclusion from various aspects of social and religious life. Like, you also stressed upon the politics of untouchability, be it untouchability and liberty, or untouchability as a spatial problems in villages and cities. You also talked about untouchability and race. Like, and I really liked how you dived and raised the question of untouchability during the partition of India and Pakistan, an important question that I feel is absent from Dalit historiography. uh, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is indeed like a global figure now, and I really loved your take and history of Babasaheb Ambedkar and internationalism. Yeah. So, like, now we will proceed with the question and answer session. Participants can raise their hands or unmute themselves to ask question, and they may also post their comments in the chat box. Uh, yes. Yes. So I think participants can now unmute themselves to ask questions. Yes, Sagar.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jesus. Uh, so, as you mentioned, that importance of studying non-European concepts in global intellectual history. So there is a resurgence or emphasis on decoloniality in political theory, or we can say decolonial political theory. So in that aspect, though Ambedkar or the untouchable movement in late 19th century and early 20th century was not directly engaged with decoloniality as per critique of empire, but can we locate Ambedkar's idea in decoloniality? What's your research tells about it?
I'm not sure, like, so you're asking what is my perspective in terms of Ambedkar and decoloniality?
Yes, exactly.
Right. So, I mean, it just depends on how you see the coloniality, of course, right? So, and how you kind of like frame it. If you're thinking of the coloniality only in terms of being independent and rejecting empire, you are absolutely right, and that is something that I kind of like show when I try to make like the connection between Ambedkar and Churchill, right? So my point here, when I make the connection with Ambedkar, Churchill, and Du Bois, is that to show that there were many different ways in which we can understand Ambedkar. So on one part, we see a more radical Ambedkar that is trying to establish connections with African Americans that would be perceived as very kind of like decolonial, but at the same time, he is thinking of using his connections with the empire, with the colonial government that he kind of like worked for 20 years or so, as a way to protect dollars, right? So when we think of the decoloniality, then we need to make to establish some differences. Are we only talking about the colonial state, or are we talking about other forms of oppression, other forms of knowledge? If we see Ambedkar as someone that was actually arguing and rejecting Sanskritic religions, if we see him as someone that was trying to kind of like question Brahminical knowledge, then we can see Ambedkar as one of the main decolonial thinkers. But it just depends on how we frame it. Does that make it? Does that answer the question, Sagar?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think Sagar has written in the chat. RK, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Professor Chiraz, you have beautifully summarized the struggle of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, and it reveals to me that you have very meticulously gone through and read his works and his philosophy in great detail. Now, my question to you is that there are many countries in the West as well as in the East who have resolved to regulate their political affairs through a democratic process, and they have adopted constitution. Article 17 of the Indian Constitution says that untouchability is abolished, whereas in daily practice, after 75 years of India's independence and adoption of that constitution, some way or other, either in manifest form or in a clandestine form, it is being practiced every day in Indian society. The hypocrisy which was prevalent in early phase of say 20th century, and when Phule is waging his struggle, that let us deny the existence of untouchability itself from Indian society. When the society is living in such a hypocritic state of affair and denying rights and not taking concrete action to mitigate those situations in society, the groups who are suffering from that kind of situation every day, what way they should wage their struggle forward? What are the, say, learning points, if we can list, say, a few? This Bahujan movement or Dalit movement in future is again standing at the crossroad. And the point is that if we put all the eggs in a basket of political power, it may not come to us. Therefore, expecting that to come and leaving all other aspects, Babasaheb Ambedkar's utopia and praxis which he has laid down, and the idealism and the methodology which actually has adopted is a complete. So therefore, without creating sound social base, which is driven by the cultural heritage uh, of positivity, how this movement can go forward, and what is your assessment? My question is, what is your assessment of Bahujan movement in India today? Thank you.
No, thank you for the comment. I mean, it's hard for me to say because as you know, like I think like the own movements have their own answers and their own methods, and they have and as you kind of like clearly sort of know, you know the problems that there are. I think from my perspective, like the main issue is what or one of like the main ways forwards is something it's actually to do what you have been doing, kind of like denouncing that the theoretical idea that untouchability has been abolished is very different than the reality of what goes on in India. The other thing, and this is something that Ambedkar sort of like has already done, but I think like this intellectual summit is also been doing, but also a lot of Dalit activists have been doing for many decades, is to create their own knowledge, to create and this is something that Dalits have always done, but I think like the importance is that of Ambedkar is that he sort of creates a new political category that allows or that helps people to come together in a more kind of like inclusive way. So doing that and going with those ideas, with that denunciation and getting political power, getting more education, kind of like challenging the patriarchy, challenging Brahmanism and so on is the way forward. This is not easy and does not resolve much, me saying it, but I think that is my own view. But it's limited it's limited and it's not what every people experience on the daily basis.
Thank you, Professor.
No, thank you for your comment and question.
Sir, Govind has asked the question in the chat. Like, do you want me to read it or will you read it?
Okay, it says, since you're researching on political untouchability, how do you see Dr. Ambedkar's overall political ontology? There is overemphasis on pragmatism always, but your presentation expands it to a larger actionable realms. Okay, so yeah, I think the overall political ontology, I would frame it depending on the time period that Ambedkar is sort of dealing with. I think Ambedkar sort of explores different possibilities. I think in the early 1910s and in the early 1920s, he's not completely against sort of trying to make Hinduism to transform Hinduism to an extent that he can get rid of untouchability, but that changes in 1930s very much, and I think that this is the 30s is where he explores the question of socialism and communism, and then we see in the 40s that he's kind of like dealing with internationalism. I think if I had to kind of like see and argue something like in one sentence, is that Ambedkar is really interested, and I know like there are many ways so I'm not saying that he wants to he doesn't want to dismantle caste altogether, but what I'm saying is that he is particularly wary he was particularly worried about destroying and dismantling the question of untouchability. I think that was his main concern that he explored in many different ways. Yeah.
Yes. Are there any other questions? Feel free to write it in the chat box or to unmute your mic and ask to Professor Jesus. Okay. I don't think, sir, there are any other questions, but I would
That's
like
fine.
I would like you to ask one question. Though, like, what inspired you to look at untouchability in Pakistan? Like,
In Pakistan.
yeah.
So like the question of Pakistan. Oh, because I mean there were many different things. One was kind of like luck. I used to live in Churchill College in Cambridge, and in Churchill College there are some archives of the Churchill papers. So as a historian, I just went there to see what was in there, and I found that um, Ambedkar had like these letters that he had sent these letters to Churchill, and that kind of like realized that actually Ambedkar was exploring that he's like writing to Churchill because he's concerned about partition and he's concerned about Pakistan. So once I sort of like identified that, of course, I knew of the existence of Ambedkar's books on Thoughts on Pakistan and Pakistan of the Partition of India. And I kind of like realized that there were that losing kind of like millions of the population in order to create two national majorities, of course, affected Ambedkar's sort of political view of the electoral system in India. So in part it was luck, but in other part it was me kind of like following Ambedkar's writings that he's arguing for different political systems. He's arguing for different things that were hard to understand if we did not bring the question of Pakistan into perspective. So that was the main thing that inspired me to do that, because as you know, and you mentioned like you were doing history, like the question of Pakistan was rarely linked to Dalits and particularly to Ambedkar, because it's usually seen as a regional issue to some extent that you can sort of find in the Punjab, or that you find in Bengal, right? So those are the people that are usually considered to be affected. So I was kind of like thinking of how do we deal with that, and why was Ambedkar writing a book and writing like books on Pakistan and so on? Does that answer something?
Yes, sir, of course. Sir, we have one question, and this will be the last question. Like, it's in the chat box. You can read it. And
To what extent Marxist imposition on Dalit movement has diluted Dr. Ambedkar's concern on erasure of untouchability discourse, assuming Marxists are not rooted in cultural issues? Well, if we're only kind of like concerned about Ambedkar, well, there was some of it. He has like some concerns about what Marxism or communism can do against the Dalit cause. And I will only give you one example that, of course, does not define everything, but it's clear why Ambedkar had certain concerns there. So, for instance, in the 1930s, when there are a lot of strikes going on in Bombay, and there are a lot of strikes sort of protesting against these bills that are trying to prevent strikes in India, and trying to prevent strikes, particularly in the milk industry, were being put forward. And Ambedkar here, he changes his views quite a bit. So at times he's in favor of creating joining unions, and sometimes he's in favor of the strikes. And sometimes when he's addressing Dalit workers in particular, he rejects these strikes and he says, well, the problem of joining kind of like unions that are meant for everyone, that are not particularly formed or created for Dalits, is that our issues or our problems that are only specific to our own people will disappear. So what he was trying to say was basically that even if you join a union, even if you had certain Marxist ideas, or even if you have certain political views that were moving to the left, in practice, as the question or comment that was put forward already pointed out, in practice, other workers that were from upper, not upper caste, but that were of higher caste than Dalits, were not going to give the rights in favor of other oppressed communities. So that is one example of that.
Yes, so I think that will bring us to the end of this session. I would like all the participants to do check out the book by Professor Jesus, Untouchability as a Political Idea, Political Thought of B.R. Ambedkar. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Jesus Cháirez for joining us today to commemorate Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's life and ideals on his 133rd birth anniversary, which will be in I think in 2 days. I also thank the organizers, Mr. Mangesh Dahiwale and Mr. Yogesh Maitreya, for orchestrating this insightful event. My gratitude extends to all the attendees for their active participation in this enriching session. I encourage everyone to please join us tomorrow for 3 engaging sessions. Shibi Peter will speak on Ambedkar and Christianity from 5 to 6 p.m. Khalid Anis Ansari will address Babasaheb Ambedkar and the Pasmanda Muslim movement from 7 to 8 p.m. And Dhananjay Vanjari will discuss Babasaheb Ambedkar and Manyavar Kanchiram from 8:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. Thank you all for being part of today's session, and Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much.